Please be seated. It's great to have new people on the altar. Thank you. My temple should be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. So say the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Today, though, we hear the same story related by John. But John does not put it at the end of Jesus' ministry, as is in the other Gospels, but at the beginning. This was taken from chapter 2. So the writer of John must have wanted or needed us to look at this event differently than the other Gospel writers did. For the writers of Mark, Luke, and Matthew, these events mentioned today were almost causally related to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. Because Jesus, at the end of his ministries in those Gospels, had come and questioned the authorities in their front yard. He called into question the institution of temple Judaism. But John had a longer view. John, with his stronger take on the divinity of Jesus, relates this differently. Because John talks to a change in how people relate to God. And that was part of his gospel message. He reiterated it in Jesus' comments to the woman by the well in another part of the gospel. And that was that the temple is not needed to experience God. That Christ himself is the new paradigm. So it is important to hear the rest of the gospel in that light. The temple was no more when John wrote his gospel. So how then were the people to have a relationship with God? John's answer was through Jesus Christ. And this is also why John explains more of Jesus' words in the gospel we read today, more than the other gospel writers ever did. The other three just spoke of the desire for the authorities to kill Jesus. They plotted against him. They did not say that the temple would be rebuilt by the resurrection of Christ. Much was to change because Jesus came and died and was resurrected. How we can worship God was to change. And how do we worship God? We come together in buildings such as these, on days designated as special. For us Christians, we gather on the day of Christ's resurrection, the first day of the week. We set it aside and make it holy and special. It is not the traditional Sabbath day, the Sabbath day mentioned in the Decalogue that we started with, or in Exodus. That day is Saturday. And even the early Christians, those Christians who were Jews, celebrated and kept the Sabbath. And then they met together as a community on Sunday to hold a liturgy to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And over time, that evolved. Over time, our customs and understandings changed. And over time, the notion that God lived and was worshipped in a temple also changed, because we do not worship God in just one place anymore. In fact, there are 3 Episcopal churches here in Trumbull that we could go worship at. This was an evolution in the consciousness of people, in the thought of people. From a mere pagan understanding of gods and gods, God and gods, which we also heard in the Decalogue. I am the Lord thou God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. To a notion of there being only one God. And God not living in a place. But still we have set aside houses for prayer. Places where it is right and proper to pray. Sanctuaries for holiness. In fact, we call this place a sanctuary. Places we can rest assured that when we come and worship, when we come and pray, we will experience the divine. Now, we Christians are a sacramental people. Catholics are sacramental people. We have a sacramental religion, and it uses the sacraments in the same sense, that it's a space where we are guaranteed to experience the grace of God. They're the places where we as believers can experience grace and touch the divine. According to our catechism, it is guaranteed. These evolved from the liturgies of temple sacrifice. Yet we still today hold them holy and apart, much as the temple Jews held the grand temple in Jerusalem in Jesus' day. When you would go there, they would say, in Jesus' day, here is where you need to come. You need to make a pilgrimage to the place where God dwelt. And then they would go, see? Because it says so right here in this book. And if you can't read it, our scribes will read it for you, in case you forgot. And our priests will sacrifice clean, blemish-free animals for you that will curry God's favor, that will restore your brokenness. Well, then along came Jesus. And his whole ministry was about breaking or evolving that type of relationship with God. And we can restore ourselves through Christ. And according to John, and God's message is that Jesus is the temple. His offerings and sacrifice are sufficient for all. And not just once, but forever. No more of those types of sacrifice are required, because everything changes with the advent of Jesus. Everything evolves with the advent of Jesus. We are now empowered. And the sacrifices that we are required to make, as I mentioned last week, the cross that we are called upon to bear is to love one another. It's to love one another. But lest you forget, though, this loving one another, it's a hard thing to do. It's just flat out hard thing to do. Especially when our lives and minds are so full of the things of the world. Especially when we hurt each other in the ways that we do. But still, our sacrifice is to love one another. So if you take this message from John and put it into the modern day, we see Jesus entering the temple. And we can ask, which temple is that? The temple had been destroyed. And if Jesus is entering our lives today, which temple is he entering? Well, he's entering the temple of our souls. And those are the true temples of our being. And I venture to say today, Jesus entering my temple would say, my house should be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. And he's letting us know how cluttered our lives are with stuff, the mechanisms of the world. And we have made our lives full of rules, full of things that we must do other than be God-centered. We have set up rules, things that we must do before we let grace fill our hearts and minds. Just like the money changers did in the temple back in Jesus' day. Roman coins were not worthy, and they had to be converted before they could be offered. If you brought in a sheep or a goat, it had to be checked to make sure it was blemish-free before it could be accepted. There were obstacles put in the way of accepting the love and grace of God. Well, Jesus is telling us that these trappings are not what it's all about. And when the rules are more important than the substance and the reason for them, they need to be cleaned out. And that needs to happen periodically. And I'm reminded by this gospel of Martin Luther. In Luther's time, he railed against the established church with its rules and mechanisms, the selling of indulgences and the keeping of scriptures in a language unapproachable to the common man, because that meant that only proscribed individuals could read the Word of God. In only prescribed ways, people could get and experience God's grace. because grace was for sale by the church. In Luther's day, the church needed to evolve. It needed to reach out of its buildings and institutions and back into the hearts of the people in the same way it did in Jesus' day. Today, too, we are perhaps at an evolutionary turning point. What we do and what we offer as an institution, as I look around this room, I see all these empty pews, and I think it seems to be less meaningful to those who live in our modern world, at least in the seemingly connected urban world. And perhaps I think we need to rethink how and where we experience the divine. How and where is Jesus entering our lives? And that can be a disturbing and radical notion. Just as Jesus' message was to the temple Jews, or Martin Luther's message was to the church at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Because the question is, how do we, each and every one of us, lead God-centered lives? How do we lead God-centered lives if we can't see God in the world? How can we reconcile those scriptures written in a pre-scientific age with the knowledge that we're just beginning to imagine? The psalm today is a perfect example of it. It describes the sun moving in its course from one part of the heavens to the other. It was a description of the way the world was, not just a description of a people's relationship with God. How do we make that real today? Well, we evolve our understanding. We evolve our understanding like we've evolved our understanding of the nature of life. And how does that evolution take place? In tiny, indiscernible steps sometimes. Because that's sort of how grace works. In small, sometimes indiscernible steps. Until something snaps, something shifts, a tectonic movement occurs, and all the changes are visible at once. How do we evolve our institution to make it more meaningful in the world today? I don't know. Except to say and to remember that we need places in our lives where we can talk to and listen to God. We need places in our lives where people of faith can come together. And we need to allow ourselves to experience the sacraments that are our lives and the lives of our community. And to do that, just like Jesus told us, we need to love each other. We need to accept each other, to care for each other without preconditions. This Lent, during our reflection and prayers, we can look for where we have let the money changers and vendors rent space in the temple of our being. And perhaps to use the principles we find in the teachings of Jesus to create cords to drive those money changers out. And then to accept the sacrifice that he gave for us so that we all can have a relationship with God. The relationship that was meant for us to have since the first human drew sacred breath.